Hello, everyone. My name is Vaishali Shah. I welcome each one of you to our session on Hindu culture and lifestyle. You're watching us live on hinduscriptures.com Facebook page. And as promised, today also we have a very interesting guest. So before we start, let's do a small prayer. Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheshwara, Guru Shakshat Parabrahma, Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha. I've always mentioned that why I do this prayer because I believe that whatever knowledge and the strength I've received is all because of my gurus. So, Sahana ji, namaste. How are you?
Namaste.
Welcome to our session. Um,
Namaste. Thank you for inviting me.
I'm glad that you finally managed to speak to our audience. So before I start and I shoot our questions, I would like you to read a small introduction about yourself to our audience so that they know who you are. Sahana Singh ji is an author and commentator based in Texas, USA. She's an environmental engineer by qualification who writes on a variety of issues, including water management, environment, and Indian history. As alumni of Delhi College of Engineering, she made a career shift to write after moving to Singapore. Her book, The Educational Heritage of Ancient India, How an Ecosystem of Learning Was Laid to Waste, has been appreciated for awakening Indians to the role played by India in spreading knowledge around the world. Her second book on the same subject is awaiting publication. Sahana has won several awards for journalism, including the Developing Asia Journalism Award in 2008. A short animation video made by her on the world's water crisis won the top prize at the TU Delft Urban Water Movie Contest, awarded by the Delft University of Technology, Netherlands, in 2012. Her articles have been published in Reader's Digest, Washington Post, Discovery Channel Asia, Asian Water Magazine, Swarajya, India Facts, and other publications. She has moderated panel discussions on water management at several international conferences. Sahana ji is director at Indian History Awareness and Research, a non-profit headquartered in Houston, USA. She's also on the board of Ishwar Seva Foundation, a US non-profit dedicated to helping Hindu refugees. She is passionate about traveling and connecting the dots across different societies, civilizations, and disciplines. So, Sahana ji, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Before we start with the main topic, I would like you to tell us something about your childhood. How did you start? Something about your early age.
Childhood. Okay, so I was born in Mysore. So my mother tongue is Kannada, but I mainly grew up in Delhi and Calcutta. So that's where I did my schooling. And then when it came to college, I went to Delhi from Calcutta to Delhi again for studying engineering, Delhi College of Engineering. So engineering is what I studied: civil engineering, environmental engineering. But I always had a deep interest in history because I do come from a family of educators. So that is, if you take my go from grandfather and to the earlier generations, my grandfather was a teacher, great grandfather, and they were all Sanskrit pandits. So
Oh,
they were experts in Sanskrit grammar. So it's only from my father's time that all this we started becoming engineers and doctors and so on. So it was like a journey of discovery for me when I got interested in history. So I started, I think we think more about ourselves, our history when we come out of the country. So when I moved to Singapore after marriage, so that is when, I was very particular about how I'm perceived, how people perceive my culture, my civilization. So I wanted to read more about it. And then from the Singapore, we moved to the US. So I think now that's you asked me about my childhood, so I've already covered that. Yeah, so childhood
yeah.
was very pan-Indian. I have been exposed to very different Indian languages, uh, Indian culture. So I speak Kannada, Hindi, Bengali, of course English. So these are the languages. Now I'm learning Sanskrit.
That is interesting because I think it's so much about Indians, that we can speak more than two, three languages very easily. which
Right.
when you go outside India, they always amazed about it. How come we can do it so well? So give us some idea about maybe your career, initial, career years that I'm sure because you are a journalist, you are good at writing. But then how did you start your research and all that? I would like to know.
Right. So as I told you, I was an engineer, but when we moved to Singapore, because I always had an interest in writing, observing and writing. That's how I actually joined an engineering magazine, which is Asian Water. I joined as assistant editor, and that article was the magazine was all about water management, water technologies that were being used in Asia. It was slowly became the number one magazine in that area after I joined because I'm very passionate about water conservation as well. That's another area that I'm working hard. I've written a lot about. So for about 19 years, I was writing mainly on water. Asian countries, how they are managing their water and all that. But at some stage, when we moved to the US, that's when I saw my daughter's textbook, the world history textbook, and that's when I realized that people don't know our history. So India Hindus were being projected as mainly people following the caste system, and where the women were not empowered. Those kind of things. That was in the textbook itself. People who didn't believe in equality. So that's when I said that, okay, now I need to research in this area and see what I can bring to the table. So I realized that there not many people writing in easy language. There were those academic books on history, and a lot of those were written by the leftist and colonized people who were not viewing India from the insider's perspective. So that's when I started writing a few articles. And of course, the more I wrote, the more people started reaching out to me, then suggesting books to me, and that's how it's a very interactive process. So I read a lot, I heard a lot of talks, met many people, and that's how my research progressed. And then a time came when I was ready to write on the this topic of educational heritage of India, because India has always been a land of knowledge. So, what were the ways in which they were learning? What were the ways in which they were teaching? That was a fascinating topic that I got into.
So how did you start your research? I mean, where did you start from? Because this is a very huge topic, and there are so many misconceptions. Because people just I mean, the world over, people have created this impression that we just don't know anything. We
Right.
just don't know anything. Whether
Mhm.
it is architecture or the fashion or the temple structures or the science, whatever. So it's a huge challenge. How did you start your research then?
So I think, you know what, we mainly, when we know our own epics, right? There are so many things in the Mahabharata, Ramayana itself, where you get an idea about. In Mahabharata itself, forest universities are described, the rishis who are teaching, and the whole atmosphere, the ecosystem of learning, which is already there in the epics. So you could say that the epics were the first, Mahabharata and Ramayana. And then after that, of course, I read the books like, the R.K. Mukherjee books written by Radha Kumud Mukherjee. That's a very important book she's written on ancient Indian education. Then Apte, Altekar, these are all the authors that I referred to. And gradually, if you see my book now, the recent book, it has more than 200 references. So I have referred to a whole lot of books, whole lot of authors. And this is the time when the scene exploded. There were so many people who were researching India at the same time. People writing on Arthashastra. Then there's Dr. Bharat Gupt, who is has so many videos where he's explaining the Kama Shastra, right, Dharma Shastra. So these are all my references.
So then, how did that convert into a book? Because we still, I mean, I don't know if you know Sanskrit, or did you take anybody's help who knew Sanskrit? Did you refer the books or the epics directly? What was your approach? Because, I want you to inspire those people who have some interest, who have got time, who have got plenty of resources, and they can do well. I'm sure they can do, so no, they can do some more research, they can write some more
Mhm.
books. So I really want you to inspire them with your story, that how did you get into the research? And because our generation has this challenge of not knowing Sanskrit so well. And there is this gap between, knowing people who know Sanskrit and people who don't know Sanskrit, and still trying to know the scriptures. So give us some idea on that line.
So I think it's so what you have to do is to find the good translations. If you don't know Sanskrit, try to find an authentic translation of the epics, of the Upanishads, and also always keep an open mind that maybe this translation is not covering everything, and then you try and corroborate that with what are the pandits saying. I mean, because discourses are always you can always go to discourses now. So many of them are online, so you can actually speak to Swamiji's, you can speak to the spiritual leaders, and you can ask them, if you have any questions about the meaning of certain passages, is this what it really means? And you can get the meaning of that. So it's a lot of, it's not just reading, but going and reaching out to scholars. So today, those scholars are easily available. A lot of them are there. You can go to, like you have Sangam talks. You have so many media where they are giving their talks, right? Apart from that, there are courses. So many short courses, like Dr. Bharat Gupt, for example. I remember in the early days, he was conducting a lot of courses. I couldn't join all of them, but I could get information about what he was teaching. And then, of course, he came to Houston as well. I listened to him, what he had to say. And similarly, there are many pundits. You can always find out, reach out to pundits and tell them to explain to you. And then on your own, you try to do your own. You try to learn Sanskrit. That also, again, you can, today's world, you cannot say that, oh, I am not able to learn Sanskrit. You want to learn Sanskrit, just type learning Sanskrit in Google and you'll know there are so many places from where you can go, even spoken Sanskrit and so on. But then, of course, when I got into properly studying the topic, I had to read what others have written about the topic before, like ancient India, whatever books are available on ancient India. I started reading them. So many histories have been written. You must also read the colonizers' narrative because you should know what they wrote, and then you know how to refute it. And then, of course, you have the wonderful websites like India Facts. It's now quite well known. India Facts. I remember it had just started when I began to read, and there were some amazing articles there which got me more interested. So today there are a lot more. India Facts is there. Then there is, I mean, you yourself have started. There is Swarajya. There are many other websites. There is Hindupedia. Hindupedia is another
Uh,
repository of facts on Hinduism, on Sanatan Dharma. So those are the websites. And then from there you go to books, and then you meet people. Then you visit the archaeological sites. That's another way you get knowledge. Each time I go to India, I try to visit old temples, historical places, buy books which are available there itself in those cities. So that's how you expand your network, which will give you more and more knowledge.
that is so true. That is how we collected 45,000 pages on our website,
Excellent.
hinduscriptures.com, because it
Mhm,
took me, initially when I started, there were not too many people and there were not too much content available on websites,
mhm.
basically. Wikipedia is very, very misleading.
Yes.
And the way dictionary cannot teach you math, science, anything, Wikipedia cannot teach you. That is the approach I was having in my mind. That
Excellent. That's a very good approach.
yeah,
To be aware of
because
the pitfalls of Wikipedia. Yes, that's
yes,
something.
yes, yeah.
Yes.
Then if you want to teach and educate somebody, then you have to come up with proper categorization. The concept should be clear. So that
Right.
is how I worked on, and that's
Mhm,
how hinduscriptures.com took the shape. But then what you are saying is absolutely correct, because I just remembered my journey. Uh,
mhm,
it's not easy, but then if you try to speak to the spiritual gurus, they have been very, very kind, and I'm
mhm.
sure they do help you out. So
So
now
they make
coming
you
to the
realize
main.
the meaning, right? The inner meaning. Otherwise, you just read. And of course, I have a huge library. If you see the books in my house, every room is full of books. That's something that I've brought back from India each time.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
very true. So now coming to the main topic, and I think I would like you to narrate us the presentation you have prepared and tell us where are the flaws and what we need to know about it.
Sure. So I think it'll be about a 40-minute presentation, maybe, or maybe
Sure.
a little bit more. If you feel I'm taking too
No,
much
no,
time, just let me know.
no, it's
Okay.
okay, because we don't see. I mean, I don't restrain on time, because we are not here to do a commercial session and with
Okay.
advertisement
Right.
coming in between. So
Okay.
yeah,
So let me
it's
just
if
share my
someone.
screen.
Yeah, someone is
Okay,
interested, they will have patience to hear you out.
great, great, great. So I'll just share my screen. Are you able to see this? Are you able to
Yes,
see
I can.
this?
Yes, I can see. I'm just checking on
Okay,
the phone at the same time if everything is properly
okay,
visible.
right. So this is the topic on which I have prepared my slides. What modern education can learn from ancient India. And so this is the book that I wrote in 2017, The Educational Heritage of Ancient India, How an Ecosystem of Learning Was Laid to Waste. So it's a very small book. It's like a summary of what our education was like at the time of its glory, and then how it was destroyed, and how we were colonized and everything. So it gives a summary of the events that took place. So this is my first book, which is still doing quite well, but now I'm working on my second book, which I'll tell you about later. So, what I want to highlight is that in ancient India, our country was full of universities, full of centers of learning. And when I say India, I'm actually referring to Greater India. It's not just the geographical boundary of India as we know today, but it includes or the western side, which was what today is known as Pakistan, Afghanistan, Western Asia, and on the eastern side, it included all these regions. The Tibet on the top, then there is all this Burma, all these places. They were they were greater India. And if you go to the south, you had Lanka, Sri Lanka, right? So you see how many, I've tried to map the centers of learning in ancient India. So in my first book, this is the map that I used. But in my second book, the empty spaces are filled up with more centers because I've come to know of more excavations, more universities, more pithas which were teaching. And as you can see, there's a cluster of universities in the east. You can see Nalanda, you can see Odantapura, Mithila. There's also Varanasi a little bit to the west. So the Bengal Bihar area or Odisha was full of universities. In fact, Bihar got its name because there were so many viharas over there, right? But the earliest university that we have excavated is Takshashila in the west. If you see in the northwest corner of the map, Takshashila, which is today in Pakistan. This is the earliest, the oldest university which has been excavated, and they say that it is about the 6th century BC, but it's probably much older than that. It could probably go back to thousands and thousands of years. And then in the West, since a lot of you would be from Gujarat, you would be interested in Vallabhi University, which was in Gujarat, also a very well-known university, and it was set up by the professors who came from Nalanda, Vikramshila. Those universities went and set up Vallabhi. And then if you go, and there are many more, Ujjaini in the center, then to go to the south, again, there are a whole lot of universities, Mathas, Kanchipuram was a very important center. Okay. And the interesting thing is that even in those times, people could choose their specialization. Students would choose and they would travel to the university they were interested in and apply for it. There would be very difficult admission tests. It was not easy at all to get admission because if you take a place like Nalanda, it was taking only 20% of students who applied. 80% were being rejected because they were not good enough. So that was the focus on meritocracy. The merit was important. Please note the university in the north in Kashmir, that is Sharda Peeth. Sharda Peeth was a very important center of education where professors and the scholars, students would go from different parts of India to refer to the library there. Okay, so Sharda Peeth had an amazing library with original manuscripts that scholars would go to refer to. All of these centers of learning were also, they also had libraries with manuscripts and books and all which people could refer to, right? And the other thing is there was a lot of mobility, though it was much harder to travel in those times, but people would travel to the university of their choice and the teachers also would move around. They would be teaching in one university at some point of time, they would be teaching in another university at another point of time. So that also was there. So this is the Takshashila University ruins. It is, as I told you, one of the oldest university excavated now in Pakistan. These are the ruins of Nalanda University in Bihar. I have visited them, and it is very painful because today it's in ruins, though it is being taken care of by the ASI. Archaeological Survey of India, but this one was brutally destroyed, which I'll come to later. Then, not very far from Nalanda is the Telhara University, which is being excavated since 2009. And I have not visited this yet, but that's what I want to tell you, that we still don't know the names of all the universities that existed, because some of them are still being excavated. India is so populated that it's difficult to dig up everything, but there are still many treasures waiting to be unearthed. So when we talk about what we can learn from ancient India, what education, modern education can learn, then we need to find out how did we become the educational capital of the world? Because students were coming from Western Asia, China, Japan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Lanka, whichever country was interested in education, which had some civilization and wanted its students to attain higher learning, they were sending their students to study in India. And also, they were also interested in getting manuscripts back from India. That was especially China and all the Southeast Asian countries. For them, getting the manuscripts was very important. Many of these students made very dangerous journeys because it was difficult. You had to pass through forests where you could be attacked by wild animals, you could be robbed, or they came by water, by ships. Again, it could be you could be shipwrecked. There could be piracy. So these were all dangerous journeys that students were making in order to get education from India. We should appreciate that. And as I mentioned earlier, the admission tests were very difficult. But we also hear about coaching centers. For example, in the villages that were surrounding Nalanda, there were actually coaching centers where students were getting trained on how to crack the admission test of Nalanda. So that reminds you of what's going on today. Even today, you can see a parallel, how there are all these coaching centers which help you to crack the IAS and how to get into IIT, similar to that. So the focus on merit led to highly original work in art, logic, grammar, mathematics, engineering, and sciences, especially medicine, chemistry, physics, metallurgy, navigation. You name it, you name any discipline, and we were experts in that. Because of this focus on merit, so we had produced so many works. And similarly, in the vocations, whatever vocations you take in arts and crafts, right, in painting, sculpture, carpentry, jewelry making, in all these areas, in the vocations also, there was excellence. There was a focus on excellence. We also need to learn from ancient India how to learn in the midst of nature, because nature was given a lot of importance. Our gurus, our teachers used to believe that you need to be surrounded by nature. It's good to be in a secluded place where you have trees, you have flowers, you have birds, you have animals, and in the midst of them, you do your studies. That was the thinking of the time. You never lost sight of nature. So it was like you how to learn from nature, that we are nature, because if you're not, otherwise we forget. Like today we are now surrounded by all these digital devices, and so we are quite separated from nature, right? Just a minute, I think something started on my computer. Okay. So a sacred view of nature was at the foundation of learning in ancient India, and this is something we need to get today. We need to get it back. Then integration and interconnectedness, these were universal traits. So nothing was viewed in isolation. Okay, what's happening? Okay, so when we were because we studied in the midst of nature, we knew that everything is interconnected, the plants, the animals, and we. So, we are all, so if you damage one part of this interconnected universe, then all the others will get affected. This understanding was very deep in our learning, in the way we learned. And we also believe that true sources of knowledge are found within the individual and entities of nature. And life has to sustain both the individual and the community. So these are the things that were very well known to our teachers in ancient times. And there was no discipline called environmental sciences or environmental engineering, because since we were also aware of nature, so the citizens did not dump their waste in the Ganga or Kaveri, as the kind of education system that we developed later on, right, where we develop these treatment. We are sending our waste into the rivers, This kind of thing could not have happened in ancient India if we had stuck to the kind of knowledge, the teaching that we had in ancient times. Then we would not have designed the kind of systems that we designed later on and we are still using today, where we are so disconnected from nature that we have to study it separately in the form of environmental sciences. The other thing is that we viewed learning as a sacred duty. So there were many ceremonies that would be held. So when a child would learn writing, tracing alphabets for the first time, that was via a ceremony called Vidyarambha, right? Or it's in Bengali call it Hate Khori. And again, there was a ceremony when we went into higher education that was called Upanayana. And then when we graduated, also that was a sacred ceremony called Samavartana. So in this way, there was a lot of a lot of respect, a lot of sacredness that was imbued within education and learning. And Saraswati being the goddess of learning, you have to take her blessings before you learn. Only then you're learning, you're giving shraddha to the subject that you're learning. I also want to talk about the modern scientific thoughts, which we consider modern today, how they have their origins in the Shastras themselves. So take a look at what is in the Nyaya Sutras by Akshapada Gautama, where he says, truth exists whether or not we humans acknowledge it. This is something that even today we believe in this. The scientists say this, that the truth exists, whether you accept it or not. So these are very logical statements, and when you go back and see them in the Shastras, you understand how logical we were. Then look at this in this quote from Sushruta Samhita, where it's written, a physician who has learned one science only cannot be sure of his own science. And for this reason, the physician has to be versed in many sciences. So what I want to highlight is that the Indian society supported learning. The teacher was the most respected person in society. The whole society supported scholars financially, emotionally, personally. And during religious ceremonies, donations were given to teachers and educational institutions. So there was a great merit associated with giving to teachers, right? Even now, when you might have noticed in ceremonies where we are giving to brahmanas, brahmanas meaning teachers, those who are keepers of knowledge, those who are going to teach. We have to give them respect, we have to give them resources. Now, education could be funded as as an act of commemoration of a departed relative. So we had that custom in ancient times where if a son was killed in war, then you could institute a scholarship in his name, and you could also set up chairs in universities. That also was there. So almost all those things that we take for granted today were actually institutionalized in ancient India. Kings gifted lands to gurus to build centers of education. There are many inscriptions which are proof for this. So you can see that the seekers of knowledge were freed from the burden of earning a livelihood. So if you decided to be a student, then the society would support you. So you wouldn't have to worry about food. Where would your food come from? Because the entire society respected you that for taking this path of education, and they would help you. They would give you food and they would take care of you. So let me just talk about the funding of higher education, from which maybe we can learn a few things today. The ethos of the times demanded that Brahmin scholars led simple lives and engaged in pursuit of knowledge without amassing riches. So it fell upon the shoulders of the wealthy non-Brahmin families and farmers to support those who devoted their entire lives to learning and teaching. Okay, so that was the ethos of the time. So they knew the sacrifices that are being made by the scholars. They are leading a very disciplined life. They have to get up very early in the morning. They have to not eat before they have given food to animals, to birds. They're following all that. So they were respected, and also they might have to stay away from their family, right? So this was respected. The expenses of education were subsidized by ruling kings. For example, Nalanda was funded by the revenues of 100 villages. So this was a very rich universities. The students and teachers received clothes, food, bedding, and medicines free of cost. Also, when the foreigners came to appear for the admission test, they could stay there in Nalanda for a couple of days until the admission test was over. And if they were not selected, then they were sent back. But after they got adequately rested from their journey. And in some ashramas, the rich students paid while the Brahmin students who were too poor to pay would opt to do menial tasks. So this is mentioned in the Jatakas. So the rich students would not probably do, I mean, the poorer students would do menial labor in lieu of fees. So the fees would be paid by those who could afford it. And when it came to dakshina, suppose a poor student is not able to give dakshina, he could actually go and ask for help and get it from the householders nearby and use that to give dakshina. Now, I also want to talk about how debating was such a tradition. This is the reason why we have so many philosophical traditions, because of debate, the tradition of debate. And it was also a tool of expanding knowledge. And I have put this picture because I want to show you this famous debate between Shankaracharya and Mandana Mishra, which was witnessed by many people. And you can see that the judge is a lady. The women were also highly educated. There were women scholars, and they were invited to adjudicate at debates. The terminology of debate was well developed. So you had technical terms, like sadhya. Sadhya is thesis, which is to be established. Siddhanta, which is proposition, tenet, or conclusion. Hetu, reason. Udaharana, pratyaksha, which is perception. Anumana, pramana. So these are all terms that were used in debate. And later on, it was became so sophisticated that there was actually a language of debate itself that was called Navya Nyaya, in which the terms were very clear and you had to use those terms, and it was even a more it was difficult. You had to learn it. You could not simply go into debate. You had to learn the language of debate and the terminology of debate. Debate was a part of education, so the centers of learning played a big role in nourishing the spirit of open debate, because after the teachers taught, the students would ask questions, and the teacher would answer, and that's how the debate would go on. The kings were fond of organizing intellectual tournaments. There are so many kings who were known for organizing intellectual tournaments. Those who were able to put forward finer points in philosophy, those who were ornate in diction, they were rewarded. In fact, they would be taken in chariots. They would be taken into the city so that everybody would know who are the important scholars of today. So communication skills were very important. I must also point out that temples were not just centers of worship. Of course, there were places of worship where people went and did their pujas, they did their sadhanas, but there were annexes built next to the temples where there would be classes held, there would be lectures. So temples were also centers of learning and books. There would be libraries. Many temples had libraries where books and manuscripts were kept for reference. These are the ruins of Sharda Peeth in Kashmir that I mentioned earlier. Only this is left now because it was barbarically destroyed, by people who didn't believe in pluralism. So this is what we are left with. But Sharda Peeth, as I mentioned, was a very important center of learning. The scholar, if you were able to debate with the scholars here, then it was like a badge of honor. And Shankaracharya had that. He debated with the scholars here. And this is an agrahara. This is found more in the south. So these are colonies of teachers' houses, and today they're all being converted to other things. Real estate is swallowing up all these agraharas, but agraharas were also centers of learning, because these were the houses where the teachers stayed, where the brahmanas stayed, and the students could go and learn from them directly in there. So the front porches that you see is where the classes would be going on, and sometimes the debates would take place right on the street, because two people from different schools of philosophy would argue right there and everybody would listen to them. And so that was the kind of intellectual stimulation that existed in those times. There was also a lot of interdisciplinarity. That is something that modern education can learn from ancient times. There was no artificial divide between religion, sciences, and other subjects. So, for example, the Brahmin priests, they needed to be well versed in mathematics, because the altars that were used for yagyas, so fire ceremonies, they had to be in accurate geometrical shapes. Then there were yantras that were drawn at the time of Homa, and they needed knowledge of solid geometry. Apart from geometry, you also needed to know astronomy and trigonometry, because they were held the priest needed to know the auspicious timings in which to hold these events. So you can see how it was all connected: astronomy, geometry, and religion at the same time, because they were all chanting, they were all praying to the divine entities. At the same time, they were using science. Uh, if you take the example of Galileo, he was arrested after an inquisition by the Catholic Church because he said the earth went around the sun. And this was in the 17th century. But in India, the priests themselves were astronomers, even in the Vedic period. So there is no question of somebody like Galileo being put under house arrest because he says that the earth goes around the sun. Nothing of that sort, because they were astronomer, they were scholar priests. That is the kind of culture that existed in India. Maths and poetry were not separated. If you look at Bhaskaracharya, his works on mathematics are in poetry. They're beautiful. There's this beautiful imagery, this beautiful poetry, but there are formulae in that. So that is the kind of skill that they had. They straddled many worlds. How to share knowledge with the world is also something that we can learn from ancient India. Thousands of Sanskrit manuscripts were carried to China. The Chinese scholars would come to study in India, and they would take the permission and they would take the manuscripts along with them. Indian astronomers and mathematicians from the best universities held high positions in China's scientific establishment. So it's not just Huan Sang and Fa Hian, the Chinese scholars that we know who came and studied in India, but there were hundreds of Indian scholars who went and settled in China and who taught there, who were heads of departments over there, and who were teaching and helping them to translate the Sanskrit books into the language there, into Chinese. So there was a thriving trade between India and Western Asia, which was most people think that we were trading in only spices and textiles and various other things that India was exporting. But actually, we were exporting knowledge too. Manuscripts used to go along the same route. So this is how the Arabs, when they got acquainted with our astronomy, and so they took a lot of knowledge from us. The works of Brahmagupta simply transformed the Arab world. The works of Brahmagupta, when they were translated into Persian and Arabic, the Arab world sat up and took notice. So Indian scholars were often invited to Baghdad. There was a house of wisdom from 8th to 13th century where a lot of manuscripts were kept, and then a lot of scholars were invited to give lectures in the Arab world. The Indian physician Manka-e-Hindi, he was in the court of the fifth Abbasid Khalifa, and he translated Sushruta Samhita into Persian. Again, it was a sensation. When Sushruta Samhita was translated into Persian and then later into Arabic, people said, wow, just look at this repository of knowledge, so much knowledge about medicine. So the Muslim intellectuals who are very well known in the Arab world, like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Al-Farghani, Al-Tabari, Al-Khwarizmi, they are all very well known because they took Indian knowledge, they translated it and made it available to the Arabic world and later on to the Western world. So this knowledge of math, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, chemistry, and even music, it went first to the Islamic world, and from there it went to Europe. Math was called Hindisa, mathematics, which meant that it pertained to India. So maths was so closely connected to India. The European Renaissance was propelled by the works of Arabic scholars. Nowadays, it's recognized that the European Renaissance was not, the works that were produced by European scholars was not really original. It came from the Arabic scholars. But then, where did the Arabic scholars get that knowledge from? They got it from India. There was a Toledo school of translators in the 12th and 13th century. Toledo is in Spain, and over there, all the manuscripts of from Arabia, from the Arabic world, from Middle East, from Baghdad, used to go there, and from there the translators would translate to Latin. And most of those works which came from the Arabic world were were written in Sanskrit. There were works of Brahmagupta, of Sushruta, and others which had been translated and into Arabic, and they were brought to Toledo, where they were translated to Latin. And that's how we had that European Renaissance, where so much of knowledge came all together in Latin. I want to show you this statue of Kumarajiva, who was extremely important in translating many Sanskrit works to Chinese, which became bestsellers in Chinese. There's a statue of him in China. He translated more than 100 works, which became masterpieces of Chinese literature. Then I have this slide which tells you about how knowledge went from India to Greece, Islamic world and Europe. I mentioned Toledo School. So the Portuguese in the colonial period, the Portuguese, Dutch, French, and British, they all collected large numbers of manuscripts. So many manuscripts in every year. In fact, there were so many manuscripts being taken from India and translated to European languages. There is Bibliotheca Malabarica, which is the catalog of over 100 Tamil manuscripts collected by one single missionary called Bartholomos Ziegenbalg from 1706 to 1708. He collected so many manuscripts. So they realized there's so much knowledge out here in Sanskrit and Tamil in India that they must quickly transport them to Europe and get them translated and put them in papers so that they can be examined further. This is the statue of Garcia de Ota in Portugal. So he lived in Goa for a very long time and amassed a lot of knowledge on medicine because he used to constantly interact with the local physicians, the Vaidyas, and he had a lot of conversations with them. He kept noting. Then he also grew those herbs in his own garden to see their efficacy. And then he wrote this book, which has a long title, Conversations on the Simplest Drugs and Medicinal Substances of India. His works were also very popular in Europe, and they were a source of information about medicine. And that's how the further medical works were written based on his works. Now, we were having a wonderful ecosystem of learning right until the 11th, 12th century, but then that dream was shattered because mindless violence was unleashed on the famous universities of India from the 12th century onwards. This is Bakhtiyar Khilji, the famous painting where he's destroying the Nalanda University. The Nalanda was destroyed. Vikramshila, Udantapuri, Jagaddala, Somapura, Vallabhi, Kashmir. A whole lot of universities were destroyed when we come to the medieval time. In the 11th century, Al-Biruni, who was in the Mahmud Ghaznavi's court, right, he had also come with him to India when the invasion happened. He described it as how Hindus scattered like atoms of dust. And he said Hindu sciences receded to areas where our hands have not yet reached them, like Kashmir, Varanasi, and South India. So when these universities were destroyed in the 11th century, uh, many of the scholars died, many of them, but there was those who escaped, and they went as far as they could from the territory which was ruled by these invaders. In the succeeding centuries, even the peripheral areas came under Islamic rule. And so there was a climate of oppression. During the Sultanate period, there was a systematic stamping out of Hindu learning, and there was a destruction of manuscripts all over northern and central India. So this is how all that knowledge that was created in ancient India, it got severely damaged. Temples and viharas were destroyed by Islamic despots. Jizya was imposed. So if they did not convert to Islam, there were humiliating conditions imposed on them. And there was an emphasis on Islamic education. Delhi became a major center of Islamic learning. So the state support for learning, which was there earlier for the Hindus, when they were generating books or knowledge in mathematics and sciences, grammar, all that, the state support went away. So the rich businessmen, the Hindu Rajas and local communities, they kept the flame of learning alight for Hindus. So in the periphery of the the Muslim territory, where in the peripheries where the Hindu Rajas still existed, over there, Sanskrit learning and knowledge in other languages was preserved. Arabic and Persian was imposed in most of the territory ruled by the Muslims. There was some respite during Akbar's rule, and madrasas were opened up for Hindu children, but again, that was all reversed during Aurangzeb's time. The other thing was that the Mughal kings missed the science and math bus because they did not build on the leading edge scientific concepts that had been presented by Hindu scholars of an earlier era, right? So All the work that was done by Brahmagupta, Bhaskaracharya, Aryabhatta, they didn't build up on that. There was an absence of science education because the Mughals were more interested in poetry than science and technology. In fact, Irfan Habib has himself said, the scholar Irfan Habib, historian, has said that the Mughal Empire has not produced a single worthwhile text on crafts or agriculture. How many volumes of poetry or histories it might have to its credit. So the Sanskrit works of scientists, mathematicians began to be forgotten in the land of its origin. Madrasas proliferated and students became adept in the finer details of the Quran and hadiths in Muslim India. But meanwhile, the Western world was making advances in science and technology. When there's a lot of proof to show how the Mughals were not interested in science and technology. Let me just skip that. It's getting too long. And let me come to British imperialism. So after the Muslim era came the British imperialism. The British, there were many European countries who sent their traders to trade in India, and then after that they began to usurp, they began to colonize India, and the British came towards the end, but they defeated all the others, and ultimately they prevailed over India. The British, when they started slowly taking over the reins of governance, right? Then the whole scenario changed. They changed the language of instruction. They imposed English on India. Now, people wonder why did the British impose English on India? The main reason was convenience, because there was a convenience attached to having English-speaking natives, because the British needed a lot of clerks. They needed people to help them to administer India. So they wanted people who could speak in their own language. So that's why they said, let's start teaching them all English. The other thing was that the military, the sepoys, could become disloyal if they studied in Persian or Sanskrit, right? Because they realize that if the people are in touch with their own languages, then they will never become loyal to the British Empire. Familiarly acquainted with English literature, the Indian would speak of great Englishmen with the same enthusiasm as the British themselves. They would reject the teachings of Brahmin priests. This is actually written in various letters that have been exchanged between the Englishmen themselves. The natives shall not rise against us because we shall stoop to raise them. So there was a whole policy by which English was imposed on the people of India to ensure that they would be good clerks, they would be good servants, and they would not become unnecessarily patriotic or nationalistic. The Macaulay's Minute, which is very famous, I hope you have heard about it. It came after 15 years of debate. The English Education Act of 1835 came after a 15-year debate where they debated on how the funds should be used, the taxes that they were collecting, how it could be used for education. And then they decided that let's just change to English medium. The Macaulay's Minute on Education is something that we should all be familiar with. We should always know what it said. What Macaulay said is that we must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern. A class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. To that class, we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country, to enrich those dialects with terms of science borrowed from the Western nomenclature, and to render them by degrees fit vehicles for conveying knowledge to the great mass of the population. So you see how what the strategy was to break down the Indian languages and break down the Indian education system. So we know a lot about what the pre-colonial education was like because of a person called Dharampal. Dharampal's book, The Beautiful Tree, is a book that everybody must read. So Vaishali, you were asking me what kind of research I did. This was one of the books that I came across, and everybody should read this because Dharampal was actually by chance he discovered when he was in India, when he was in London, and he was visiting the libraries in London, he came across many surveys that were done by the British in order to assess the level of education in India. And then he came across all the indigenous surveys that they did, which showed that schooling was actually very good in India. When the British came, they were surprised to find that schooling was not bad at all. And children were learning in their own languages. They were well versed in mathematics in their own languages. It was a customized education that they were having, right? And the survey showed that every village in India had a pathshala. There were 100,000 pathshalas in Bihar and Bengal alone. Reading, writing, epics, arithmetic, all of these were taught, and literacy was very high. There were dedicated teachers, there were superior methods of teaching, there was high attendance. So it's very surprising. We always thought that we were backward, and the British came and taught us. But actually, what Dharampal found out was that the British themselves have documented that there were many superior methods of teaching, and many schools had Shudras in high attendance, right? In a large number of schools, the Shudras were in majority, while the Brahmanas and Vaishyas were in minority. These are the tables that you will find. These come from those surveys done by the British, that there were more Shudras than Brahmanas in many Pathshalas. There were also innovative teaching and examination methods that were reported by the British when they did the survey of indigenous education in India. So there is one Reverend Andrew Bell. He was very impressed with the teaching method in the rural schools in Madras Presidency. So what he saw was that the older children were teaching the younger children. So he noticed that if they were in most of the schools, village schools in Tamil Nadu, there was a heap of sand outside the schools. So the children were learning how to all the alphabets and numerals by tracing them on sand. And many times there was no teacher present, but the elder students were teaching the younger students. So he was very impressed because England at that time had very low literacy. And that was because they thought that education means that you need an infrastructure, you need schools, you need blackboards, you need teachers. So they never knew there was a low cost way by which education could be widespread all over the country. So this sand tracing system, the sand tracing sand on sand meant that you didn't need blackboards, and training the older children to teach the younger children was a technique that was an amazing technique. So whereby you didn't need a whole lot of teachers. So this was the system that and that Andrew Bell liked so much that he called it the Madras method. And by 1821, 300,000 children were being educated under Dr. Bell's principles, and his ideas were taken up in Europe, West Indies, and even Bogota. And Reverend Robertson also noticed a very interesting way of conducting examinations, which he reported. I'll not go into that because it's getting too long. So this is Madras College in St. Andrews in UK, which still stands today, and it was inspired by Indian methods of learning and teaching. So later on, as the British rule progressed, after some decades of British rule, poverty and famines became rampant under the British. So once upon a time, India was the richest country in the world, and slowly it was reduced to abject poverty, and its whole education system at the grassroots level broke down, right? So we saw how the higher education system was broken down during the Muslim rule, but the grassroots level education system was broken down by the British, by colonialism. Everything that India produced, food grains, textiles, steel, gold, everything was used by Britain. It was India became like a factory for Britain, right? There was no food for teachers and students in pathshalas. Earlier, the villages used to give food to the teachers and students. Now they themselves were so poor that these pathshalas could not be sustained. So in places like Tanjavur, mass poverty was created overnight by imposition of 59% taxation of gross produce. Can you imagine that level of taxation? They were literally fleeced. The district collector's role was to fleece the citizens. But it is strange that even today we call them district collectors. Temples were not spared. They had to part with their donations and they fell into disrepair. So the British educational policies sounded the death knell for regional languages. Mother tongues they got relegated to second languages. So Gandhiji said in 1931 that the British had left India more illiterate than it was just 100 years before. That's true because now people were disconnected from their own languages. They were being forced to learn English. And then as a result, they could not learn English so fast. So they were being called illiterate. Now, we can't blame the British for everything. When India became independent from the British, there was a chance to decolonize, but that didn't happen. India's self-gaze, the way we look at ourselves, is still through alien eyes. And the past heritage lies buried in Sanskrit and regional literature. Now I want to talk about what ideas we can take from India, from India's educational system. First is the concept of universal education as a prerequisite to prosperity and happiness, skill-based education for majority, and higher education only for true seekers. So not everybody needs to go in for higher education. The system was that the skills, acquiring a skill was the main goal of education for the majority of the people, so that they could earn a livelihood. And the Jati system of India, which has been severely condemned because of its latter day distortion, is actually not right, because the Jati system helped to preserve the knowledge of practical skills and disciplines down the generations. That's how so much of sculpture, art, and all these things were produced in India because of the Jati system. The skills were developed at a young age by observing and assisting. This has been also taken up in the new education policy. The love of learning, that was very much there. Learning was not forced on students. The love of learning was inculcated so that they themselves would seek out knowledge. Moral values were woven into academics, dharma based approach, shraddha, integrity, commitment, discipline, hygiene. So education was not just for a career but for life itself. These are the other ideas we can take from ancient Indian educational systems: memory training, spirit of inquiry, logical thinking, debating, concept of mentorship, self awareness, spirituality, self care of health, interdisciplinary and collaborative, care of nature. I've mentioned them before. So I've come almost to the end of my talk. This is I'm going to be releasing my second book sometime in June 2021. It will be tentatively titled Revisiting the Educational Heritage of India. It will be available in Hindi and English. Eventually, it will be available in other languages like Gujarati, Kannada, and it will have more details of whatever was in the first book. So thank you very much for listening to me. These are my contact details. You can email me at this email address, or you can find my book on the first book on Amazon, and you can find me on Facebook, YouTube. So with this, I come to the end of my talk. Let me just stop sharing my screen. I've spoken a lot. We'll drink
No,
some
it was
water.
so wonderful to know what you explained, because people don't know what we have gone through as educational, as intellectual country, because people
Mm,
I mean, I think we and even today we have not been successful in narrating our history when it comes to knowledge, and we still allow people to judge us and tell us that our scriptures are not, scientific or not valid and not authentic. They ask for the so-called proof, and they
mm,
want to know so many other things. How do you know it happened? How do you know? So I think it's a very good beginning to let people know. It's a very good and eye-opening, effort, that people should know that this is how it was earlier, and from there on we have to build our new education system, which I think it's time that we change, and we implement that.
right.
Implement that. So thank you so much for your time. But okay, a couple of questions I've noted.
Mhm.
Wait, I think I still have to know. You said those subjects were taught in the universities, and our leaders knew the astronomy and the priest. I wanted to know if they were getting paid, or it was only the food was given to the Brahmins or the teachers.
You mean, were the teachers being paid? That's your question, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So it depended on how much money was available, because certain inscriptions, if you see in southern India, it is actually talking about how much is to be given to the teachers and how much of scholarship is to be given to the students. All that is mentioned, right? But I think many of them were just, they were okay as long as their food and their needs were taken care of. They were just there for the joy of teaching, because they
Okay.
were, many of them didn't, those who had families, of course, they would need, uh, hello, is that your son?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. There were, I mean, I cannot say there wasn't one standard policy where everybody is getting salaries or anything like that, but there were different models available. So maybe some of them were getting salaries, maybe the kings were giving it to them. But in other places, it was mainly a question of the needs being taken care of. The whatever was needed, that was taken care of by the society.
The reason I'm asking you is, we have created this impression that Brahmins were suppressing others and they were rich. Now, I
No,
have
no.
never heard that Brahmins were rich or hoarders of money, because it was always the kings or the merchants, as in people
Right.
like us, the banyas, who were
Yes.
supposed to hold the money and the whole economy and all, not the
Correct,
Brahmins and
absolutely.
not even the
So the
Shudras.
Vaishyas used to respect the Brahmins a lot. I mean, they would
Yes, they were
respect them for
expected.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, they were
And of
supposed to
course, there
impart
would
the
have been
knowledge.
those Brahmins who were not following the norms. I mean, everybody would not have been angelic. The lure of money would have seduced some people, and then they would not get the respect that the other Brahmins would get, who are true scholars, right?
Right, right, right. Yeah, that is the reason I wanted to ask you this question, because it's very important for people to know that, the status of Brahmins all throughout, like our huge history, the huge time, even if we go back till Mahabharat time, Brahmins were not holding or not hoarders of money. They were always hoarders of knowledge, and their job was only to teach and, run the patshalas
Right,
and gurukuls and
right.
be with be the advisor to the king. So all those things people have completely forgotten, and now we call them as, suppressors to us, which is really strange.
That's
And
not true. They were keepers of knowledge. But one
yeah,
thing I must add is that there was a lot of, the interference by the British, which caused a change in the socio-economic system. So yes, earlier the Brahmanas were not supposed to amass wealth, and they were teaching, whereas the Vaishyas. So when there was a proper structure to the society, what happened in later times is when the British forced English as the as the language of administration, and also medium of instruction. So what happened was more and more Brahmanas were adept in English, and they were recruited into the civil services, and so they were put in positions where they are collecting the taxes and all that. So obviously that is how that whole change where the Brahmanas are seen as powerful people, that happened much later. And this was not natural to the society. This happened because of interference in the socio-economic system.
that's so true. And secondly, when we say their education system was so elaborated and they took the manuscript, like for example, Chinese and even Arabics. So I think it's time that we find out from China, and because I know in Tibet, lots of Hindu scriptures are there in their libraries, and Tibet has is the place where many scriptures, not only about Hinduism but even the Buddhist scripts are preserved and they are kept there. So those I think it's time that we do something about that, because if they have
Yes.
preserved till now, then it's time that we maybe call them back, or we at least open the gate and we try to communicate. Because if we don't bring back our scriptures from, say, Germany or other places, we'll not know a lot of things. So I feel that it's time that, since you are propagating this topic, it's time that we also discuss that how to bring back our scriptures
That's
from
a huge
various.
subject, very important topic that you have brought out.
Yes.
Because even when I went to, like for example, when I went to Russia,
Hmm.
there I saw the in the university they had some old manuscripts. So a lot of old manuscripts. Of course, they're digitizing them, and they're sometimes making them available for people to read. But yes, there is a major translation movement needed now of manuscripts in Tibet and China, which we need to know more about what they wrote about India. Actually, we
Yes.
know a lot because of that. I was reading about how Japanese have
Hmm.
preserved so many manuscripts, Sanskrit manuscripts,
Hmm.
and from them we are learning about what our own educational system was like. You know,
That is true. I think he's very eager to see you. He's
he's
running
so
over.
sweet. I mean, he's incredibly sweet. Hello,
Sigitanshu.
baby.
Say
What's
hello.
your name?
Sigitanshu. Okay, so I think it was a wonderful session. Thank you so
Right,
much for your insight. And
right.
I hope the audience will also enjoy. Those who are watching us live, If at all you missed, you will see this the video and presentation tomorrow on YouTube channel Hindu Scriptures as well. And thank you, Sahana ji. Thank you so much for
Thank
being
you
with
so
me.
much.
Thank you.
It was a
Namaste.
pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, Tata kar de.